Hello, everyone. My name is MouBanerjee. I have a PhD from the history department here at Harvard, and I will be teaching for Clemson University from the fall. The reason I'm here is because I have been a great football fan. I call it football because all Indians call it football. A football fan for a very, very long time. India is a football mad nation. Our own football team, the men's football team, of course, ranks somewhere in the 140s, I think. So we basically have adopted Brazil and Argentina, and to an extent Germany as our personal football, teams to support. But we had a fantastic panel right now, and there are so many questions and so many important issues that have come up. Now we have a very distinguished, illustrious panel here, and I'm going to introduce all of them, and then I'll ask a few questions and open up the exchange between our panelists and the members of our roundtable. We have Kelly Nascimento de Luca, born in Santos, Brazil. Kelly is the eldest daughter of the Brazilian soccer legend Pelé. Pelé moved his family to Manhattan in 1975 to play for the New York Cosmos, and Kelly remained a New Yorker ever since. Kelly attended the Parsons School of Design and has worked as an editorial, portrait, and social commentary photographer, creative director, and producer of multimedia and art projects. During the 2014 World Cup, hosted by her native Brazil for the first time since 1950, Kelly documented her father in a video blog for which she created daily content chronicling his experience and giving the world a peek at the real Pelé. The real Pelé was broadcast by major television stations worldwide. Kelly is the founder of Warrior Women of Football, a documentary and a global multi-platform initiative to promote women's soccer and equality around the world. She is also a proud ambassador for the Global Goals World Cup. Welcome. Next, we have Susie DeLellis Petruccelli. Susie is a former Harvard women's soccer player, captain and Ivy League champion, youth coach, and author of a book in development, Title IX and the Tampons. Through her work as an author and activist, she has first-hand knowledge of the issues surrounding gender inequality in sports and soccer. She works with the Coaches Across Continents ASK for Choice team. Is it ASK or is? Ask for Choice team, and the Global Goals World, and she played with the Coaches Across Continent for the Global Goals World Cup in New York in 2017. Susie is currently working on a documentary and a global multi-platform initiative called Warrior Women of Football to promote women's soccer and equality around the world. If you saw her visiting card, it had a fantastic graphic of the documentary that she is making. Susie is an advocate for the Equality League's No Ban for Women campaign to end the ban of women in stadiums in Iran. Susie also invests in female-founded projects and startups like Build and Imagine, a female-owned toy company that designs STEM-building toys for girls. Previously, she worked in technology with experience in programming, systems administration, and web design. Welcome. Dr. Leanne Doherty is the interim dean for the College of Arts and Sciences at Simmons College. Before beginning her tenure as the interim dean, Dr. Doherty served as the associate dean of academic affairs, where she was responsible for the design and development of new curriculum and the implementation of academic policies and procedures in the College of Arts and Sciences. She continues to serve as the director of the honors program and as the program director for the Masters in Public Policy. As associate professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, Dr. Doherty taught courses in American politics with a focus on gender and public policy. She is the co-creator of the Master in Public Policy program, as well as the creator and former director of the Lee Family Foundation Intern Fellowships program. She has also published research on political science and pedagogy in Political Science and Politics, Journal of Political Science Education, and Politics and Gender. Her current research project looks at the role that social media plays on the definitions of gender in politics and sports. Then we have Samantha Harvey, who is a professor of English literature at Boise State University. She did her BA at Harvard and her PhD at Cambridge University. She also competed internationally for the United States for 8 years and for Brazil for 4 years in the sport of modern pentathlon, which comprises running, swimming, shooting, fencing, and equestrian stadium jumping. She was the first woman pentathlete to compete for Brazil in the 2004 Olympic Games in Athens. Last, we have Maya Mendoza Ekstrom, entering her 4th season as the Sounders FC General Counsel in 2017, overseeing and advising on the legal aspects of all club operations and strategic planning. In addition, she serves as a government affairs director for the organization. Prior to joining the club, Mendoza Ekstrom was in the private practice for 7 years at Mendoza Law Center, dealing in all manner of business transactions, serving as outside general counsel, and providing assistance with corporate formation and governance, real estate transactions, intellectual property licensing, and many other matters. A born and raised Seattle Sounders fan, Maya grew up watching Sounders FC in previous iterations in the NASL, in the A-League, and in the USL. Mendoza Ekstrom received her Juris Doctor from the University of Washington. She serves as board member for the RAVE Foundation, the official charitable arm of Sounders FC, working to build small and innovative soccer fields dedicated for free play in communities in Seattle. We welcome all our panelists, and I'm sure we are going to have an extraordinary discussion today. As the facilitator for the roundtable, I will use my privilege to try and bring out the one issue which I think was common across the brilliant presentations that preceded the roundtable, and that was of inclusion and the idea of how women perform their gender identities and how they act against or act in reaction to what those gender identities, the constraints that those gender identities might place on them when they want to be a part of athletics, when they want to be part of what is generally seen as men's arenas. I was just wondering if our panelists would take that up and offer your own practical views of how we can overcome such constraints that are placed on women.
So I'll start.
Yeah, good.
Take it away, please.
I can only call myself an Olympian because of a decision made by the 2000 Olympics Committee for Sydney. They decided that modern pentathlon had had a World Cup circuit for women for over 30 years, and they should be included in the Olympics. And as opposed to the men who had been in since the first modern Olympics in 1895, they had both an individual and a team event, which was taking up a certain number of slots. And so that committee decided, well, you're not going to get your team event, you're going to get your men's individual, and you're going to have women's individual. So that decision was a decision of inclusion, to make a fair decision within the Olympic infrastructure to allow women to compete. And it completely transformed my sport. So I had about 6 years of competing internationally before we were Olympic, and then I saw what happened after we became Olympic. So I feel like a lot of the things that were talked about on this panel were solved by not only inclusion, opening up the inclusion and protecting the inclusion, and then a lot of things kind of slotted into place after that. But it really was the heroics of the campaign to get women into a sport that had always had, well, not always, but had a robust women's competitive circuit for 30 years, and that was finally recognized that we needed to have our Olympic berth, and it worked. So it was a happy story.
I believe all of us played in the United States, yes? Could I make that assumption? Or abroad as well? If no. Those of us that are of a certain age, I call us Title IX babies. And meaning that Title IX passage in 1979 and then onwards, I benefited from scholarships that weren't available to those that came before me. So I was a college athlete who went on a basketball scholarship to college, to an institution I probably wouldn't have gone to had I not played basketball, because I couldn't afford it. So the same patterns of inclusion when it comes to higher education worked for me for a benefit. So not only did more women go to law school and medical school, but more women participated in certain areas that they wouldn't have before. So I think another part of inclusion is good federal policy, quotation fingers around good. I think that's important. Secondly, it's also a dance, if you will. All of us in our bios, which I need to put to the front now, more than I'm not going to be dean anymore, is either participated and now coach. Finding avenues of coaching is really important, especially avenues where you might not have thought you should participate. So I coach little boys, and we did really well. And so now people want me to coach little boys again, now that they're bigger boys. And as a result of that, those avenues that you don't think are open have been opportunities for advancement as well. That's not to say that there's equity around coaching boys for women, just as we argue that fewer women are coaching women in the arena. And that goes to my third point, which was raised this morning as well, which is fantastic and important. You got to be good. And the better you are, the more you get away with. And I think that that's left on the table a little bit as far as a discussion is concerned. There's privilege that comes with success. And the more success one has, the more privilege they get. So you're looking at women in front of you that I think benefited from some type of privilege that came with athletic competency and success.
And I'll jump on that. I'm a Title IX baby too. I think what resonated really directly with the group before and the papers was specifically when I was growing up and playing, and specifically playing soccer, the gender sort of identity I wanted to portray outside of the stadium or off the field was picked for me. So I was an athlete. That means I'm a tomboy, and I can't be feminine as well. And I think that fundamentally has changed, or starting to change, at least. Look, I also think gender is a function of place. I live in a very liberal, progressive bastion in the Pacific Northwest. I understand that. There are very nuanced conversations that are happening there around gender. We're one of the blue states, right? So, but at the same time, I don't think that we're equipped to have that depth of discourse, because my daughter, who's 3.5, loves the Disney princesses. She loves them because she says they're brave, they're strong, and they help people. That is not the version of the Disney princesses I grew up with. Damsels in distress who needed a man and couldn't get anything done by themselves. And so that's fascinating to me as a mother now, to say that is now the conversation I'm having. Like, yeah, put your Rapunzel dress on, go out in the backyard, and let's go kick a soccer ball around. Like, that's okay. And so I think, in contrast to sort of the practical experience of, I very much wore all sports equipment all the time in high school, very much wore a sports bra every day, really didn't own dresses until I got out of college. I mean, that was just, my gender was picked for me because I was an athlete. And again, wouldn't change it for the world, because the other side of that, now sitting in a C-suite in a male professional sport environment, I can go toe-to-toe with any sort of really misogynistic sort of male that I can come across, because I've seen them all before, and I feel competitive enough to be in that environment. But was that the right path to get there, right? So I think that's my internal battle and conversation that I'm having, and it is now becoming more nuanced, I would say.
The interesting thing, I think, about inclusion and acceptance is that it varies so much. The level of equality and inclusion and acceptance varies so much, around the world. And I find that in many places that, in studying this for a couple of years and interviewing so many people, in Brazil, for instance, and many other places, it's not so much that you need to prove that you can play like a man or as well as a man. It is more that you have to prove that you can play well and still be what men expect you to be, so for example, in Brazil, there's a huge pushback against, this is 2015, the CBF, which is our federation, chose someone from within their ranks to promote the women's game. He was a physical therapist. His last name was Cunha. And he did an interview with The Telegraph in 2015. And he said that, it was going to get much better. And absolutely, we're going to have bigger crowds. The shorts are getting shorter. The shirts are getting small. Yeah, we're going to make the shirts a little more tailored. Everyone's going to wear makeup. He said, because we know that nobody wants to go watch women that look like men. So, there was an entire tournament in 2011 that no one was allowed to play unless their hair was a certain length. And this is happening in the country of football, right? This is the country of, it's a country of men's football, right? We have amazing women fans, but, they can't play. So our incredible team is, in spite of having very little support, And I think you find that everywhere. And I think trying to conform to a male expectation of what you're supposed to be is still a huge struggle. And sometimes I think talent creates a bigger difficulty, right? And I mean, it's like natural talent sometimes because you have to double prove that you're still feminine, Yeah. Exactly. So, yeah. So it's interesting to see. I mean, there's tons of pushback, and then there's also the reverse, right? Maybe I am feminine, and maybe I like being pretty, and I can still kick ass on the soccer field, right? So, and does that mean I'm less athletic? Right. Does that mean that I should be less respected because I do want to get my nails done? Right. And it's just conversations that men don't have to have ever. Who cares, right? You get paid $95 million. Who cares if you have nail polish on? And I think we will equalize it a little more when we start treating them like athletes. And not like men, women, or other, right? They're athletes. So I think I think that the U.S. is an incredible bastion of hope for all, but it's a very different conversation in a lot of places.
Okay, so I have an interesting story with identity because I'm an identical twin, but I'll get to that. Is this one? Not that it matters. You guys can probably hear me, right? So I'm also a Title IX baby, of course. I was born 2 years and a day after Title IX was passed, and it shaped my entire life, and I had no idea. I had never heard of it. I was at Harvard playing soccer, right? The purpose of Title IX was to get women into higher education. The side effect, the unforeseen side effect, was that it had this benefit on women's sports. Right, so I was at Harvard playing soccer and had never heard of Title IX. So I was born into a family that were athletes. My dad played football at Stanford. My brothers were both athletes. And Lillian was talking about, I don't think he's here, but he was talking about the moment that he realized he was black when he arrived in Paris. And that made me think of the moment that I realized I was a girl, because up until that point I was just an athlete. And that moment was when I wasn't allowed to play my father's sport. I wasn't allowed to play football. And then I wasn't allowed to play my brother's favorite sport, which was baseball. So, and then I also had this dynamic being an identical twin. We were taught to have different identities, right? We were supposed to be looking for our own identities. She decided very early on that she was going to be the student, which is great. So that left me with the athlete. So I got to become, I got to sort of hoard that for myself. And it became so ingrained and so important to me that later on, when I got hurt and I lost the ability to play soccer, I was destroyed, totally destroyed. And it has taken me a very long time to figure that out and figure out who I am without soccer. Obviously now I've figured out a way to get back into it. So that's my history with identity and athleticism.
I'm always reminded of that wonderful scene in Bend It Like Beckham, where, of course, through the entire film, the idea is that the woman has to, Parminder Nagra, who's the Indian girl playing football and can bend it like Beckham, has to keep on coming up against her mother and has to put on makeup, wear a sari. And then there's this one scene, where Keira Knightley's character, her parents accuse her of being a lesbian. Yeah. And there's complete, befuddlement. Her mother says, she's not Lebanese, she's Indian. Which, in this amazing moment, all the struggles that women athletes go through have to face. I was going to ask another question, and then I'll open it up to the floor in general. We have talked a lot about women trying to make space within men's sports, as fans, as spectators, as coaches. What about women as fans of women's sports? We just saw the women's hockey league take off because women were such great proponents of it. We just saw the women's soccer team in the US ask for pay parity because they proved that there was a fan base for them. Since all of you are women, most of you have been athletes and work with women, could you just give us some perspective on that? Thank you.
I'll say something. Julie Foudy is one of our executive producers, and I've known her since she recruited me at Stanford back in the early 90s. But she tells a story about when they were trying to negotiate what stadiums they were going to use for the 1999 World Cup, especially for the final. And they were pushing to use the Rose Bowl. And U.S. Soccer was pushing back because they said, there's no way you're going to fill the Rose Bowl. It's not going to be a great atmosphere. And, they believed in themselves. And they definitely were moments of doubt, right? They're thinking, like, are we going to show up and the stadium's going to be empty? Because it had happened to them along the road. They had been playing since, the early 80s. And they would get back from winning the World Cup in China, and there would be two people at the airport to greet them. One was their driver, and one, somebody was getting picked up. So they've had that experience where no one showed up. And so when the story is, and actually she has video of it, they pull up in their bus on the team, and they start to see the crowd. Oh my God, I'm gonna cry. They start to see the crowd, and they start to see little girls with flags, and little girls with, dressed up in red, white, and blue, and people wearing, their jerseys, and even, obviously men, dads, with holding their little daughters' hands, like walking into the stadium. And they filled that stadium, and they broke records. And, and then, we've been, crushing numbers ever since. We just set records in Mexico for a women's game. There are 50,000 women in Mexico for a women's game. So I think, fans will come.
Although there is something that's interesting, and that's, a couple of things we always talk about. So recently we were talking to a group of ladies in New York, and they were all, in their 60s, and one of them said, after our talk, and we talked about our project, she said, I love basketball. Why don't I watch women's basketball? Yeah. And I thought, and I didn't know what to say, and I thought, well, I don't know. And she goes, and it just dawned on her. She's like, why don't I watch women's basketball? And, there's the issue of representation in the media, right? So, for example, I love basketball, and I don't have time to watch the whole game. So I have on Instagram every single House of Highlights, Bleacher Report, so I can see little, right? Not in any of them is there a woman's sport or a clip of a woman's sport ever. And then when she said that, I started looking, right? And so there's also this study, and I'm terrible with the names, but there's a great study. Do you remember where it is from?
It's from USC. His name was Michael Messner, I want to say.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I actually met him last year at the Radcliffe Institute, had a seminar on gender in sports. And he wrote a paper called Gender Blend Media, where he was saying that it's a self-perpetuating cycle where the way that they're broadcasting women's sports is bland. So, like, the commentary is bland, and the camera angles are bland, and they're using one camera, and the camera, first of all, the footage, the cameras themselves are not at the same level as they would use in the NFL or the EPL or whatever. So we're behind the 8 ball already because of the level of broadcasting and just the enthusiasm. Like, when an announcer is announcing the World Series, he's like, and he's hitting it out of the park, and he's screaming and yelling, and you can just imagine he's going out of his mind, he's sweating, and when they're talking about women's sports, they're like, and she went down the sideline and scored the goal.
It was a 20-year study, and they measured language. So it went everywhere from where in the beginning of the study, the language was just blatantly sexist. Like, she does it as well as she cooks, I bet. To where it went through. Yeah, it went through, and then finally, now it is just the adjectives, the verbs are not as active. It is a completely and 4% of the sports coverage is women's sports in the U.S. 4%.
So I think it's important, too, to keep in mind the economics of this. Before 1986, the NBA Finals were not broadcast live in the United States. Can you imagine not showing the Cleveland Cavaliers and Golden State Warriors playing live, last night? They were on tape delay. The NBA was going to fold after the ABA joined them. And what made that important was there was a story that was being told. And where we see narratives in women's sports tends to be around the individual as opposed to team sports right now. So the Williams sisters, for example. The idea there's pay equity in tennis right now for men and women is because of the marketing power of those two women and their success. Women make up 54% of all the purchasing power of athletic apparel in the United States. That's billions and billions of dollars. So I think what we're talking about here is not only the press coverage, but it's the economic viability of these narratives. And when we become more and more entrenched in narratives of economics that are celebrity story, right? When Magic Johnson and Larry Bird became frenemies in the NBA, they had their story and they played it. And I think the heteronormative narratives we have in this country that don't transfer to female sports, the idea of a cisgendered person participating in sports that doesn't play as well with women's sports as it does with men, two titans fighting, two women fighting for glory does not play as well because of the stereotypes around what we think of gender identity. So all those things in play means, is it the product? Because I think there's a lot of people out there that want to say, oh, the product's not as good. The product's fantastic. The caliber of the sport is fantastic. You know, it's not that. So I wish we could say, well, if only we just watched it because they could dunk, right? Or they could bicycle kick, right? Or whatever. It's economic, and it's social constructs of gender that really play into this, and to the point where that in turn puts it on at bad times, right? The WNBA play and WNBA plays when the NBA is not playing.
Right, exactly.
Right, so.
Right. And Nancy Dubuque, who's the president of Lifetime, finally was the first ever, to buy the women's soccer to show on TV, and it shows at 4 p.m. on Saturdays, which, and then so many of these decisions become, well, we tried, but the attempt was, clearly going to fail, and now they have women playing at 4 p.m. in July in Texas and Florida, and and dehydrating, and you know what I mean, and it'll be one of those things like, well, we tried.
I think the other interesting thing that's happening right now, but the WNBA this year adopted a take a seat, take a stand campaign. So a portion of every ticket sale that the WNBA generates this year, the clubs got together, is going to go back to sort of Me Too movement and sort of discrimination in sports. And they are getting influencers from Isaiah Thomas's local Tacoma native. I know he's a Bostonian now, but he's one of them to sort of step up and take this pledge. And it's about putting cheeks in seats in venues, not dissimilar to why the Bernabeu was built to 120,000 fans, because that was the source of revenue. And one of the thought processes from the WNBA, is that if we can get more folks in the building, then some of those things start to happen. Because if it's compelling on the court, if the atmosphere looks right, looks more like a heteronormative American sport, then you can start to sell it in the same way. I think that's the challenge. I think the economics of it, don't allow for it to have its own narrative right now. I don't know that we're going to be there for forever. And I do think that as more women executives take over teams, our WNBA team's owned by 3 women, 3 independent Seattle wealthy women who bought it from Clay's hands before he tried to take it with him to Oklahoma City, like he did with the Sonics. And but it's stable. And it has a following. Now, the fan base isn't big enough, but I look at myself and I go, gosh, I got to suck it up. I've got to make this core business for my family as, my economic buying power too in our market to do this. And so I do think that the WNBA specifically has a plan towards sort of how they get more relevance and more corporate dollars in a heteronormative system. But I think we're a long way of saying that women's sports, can own their own narrative and make that narrative profitable.
I'd like to jump in with this because modern pentathlon's a very anomalous sport, as you might have guessed by now. But we had some similar issues with economic viability and narrative, because every time I talk about pentathlon, people say, oh, like biathlon. Obviously, biathlon's doing a better job because people know that it's skiing and shooting. Partly it's because there are fewer winter sports, and so there's more time for the media to explore the history. We have an amazing history in modern pentathlon. We go back to Napoleonic soldiers crossing enemy lines, and you have to be able to ride horses out of a cavalry string, and you have to be able to fence, and you have to be able to shoot. but that story doesn't get told, that narrative hasn't been told. So for us, it isn't so much about male versus female pentathletes. We share that issue of trying to get airtime, and it's a very European sport. It's taken a long time to even, I mean, unless there's an American who can win a medal, it won't even get shown on NBC. But one thing I'd like to say about it is that 3 of those sports, fencing, shooting, and equestrian, are pretty, well, fencing is still separated by men and women, but for shooting and for the equestrian, men and women compete against each other. They finally started separating the shooting, but women can beat men in shooting. That's why they changed it to 40 shots and 60 shots in some events. But for me, I always trained and competed with men. And so I guess that made me feel differently about some of the things said today, just because my experience was there were a lot of gender-free spaces for me. And that's because our sport is so small that you just can't, I mean, if you want to become a good fencer, you have to go to Hungary and you have to fence men and women. And so for me, that I never really reflected on that until really I had a chance to in this venue. But I do think that it's very important to think about the narrative that is told, because that is where I think individual athletes, coaches, administration, this is where things are malleable. And this is why I get a little frustrated with American coverage of the Olympics, because they tend to fall into these certain narrative ruts that are very, very pervasive. And so I happened to go to the London Olympics. I got to see a Brazilian win a medal there, which was my successor. It was very exciting. But I saw they got really good commentators for pentathlon. They had great coverage. It wasn't all soap operas about, who broke their leg, 2 months before. But really what I saw was that, wow, the good narrative is what we need, not just for small sports, for women's sports, for inclusion is partly about telling a story well and telling a story broadly and making sure that everyone can be in that story. And so that's where my faith lies, and that takes activism at many levels.
I'll open up the questions, but I'll give the first chance to our panelists there if they have questions to ask.
Well, there was something I was wondering related to that last exchange about recruiting women to be fans of women's sports. And I thought of it when Leanne was talking about economics, because a completely different version of economics came to my mind, which is the personal economics of what you get for your effort. So a woman becomes I don't know. I don't study fandom like these two. But I could imagine that some of the benefit of being a fan of football, of being American football or European football, that it's cultural capital, that it's the ability to then have something to talk about with the people who are power brokers in your job, who are men, or with the people who are otherwise influence makers in your world. So you're not going to get that benefit if you rechannel your fandom into women's sports. So I just think that's the challenge that we're up against here. That it's not just something about, it's the media, and it's it is all that, but it's also this is a bigger problem, because we need to change how we distribute cultural capital around sport. And maybe that requires being more concerted about first getting men to support women's sports, because then it'll be safe for women to support women's sports. Or it will be cost-benefit friendly for women to support women's
Well, I also think that it's I always have this one analogy that I love. So I think that it's about marketing women's sports, right? It's about making women's sports, and that's America. This is what we do, right? I mean, when people say, well, people don't go, I'm like, Americans sold a rock to hundreds of thousands of people in the 70s. It was a pet rock. It wasn't it wasn't a painted rock or a magic rock. It was a rock that they would just pick up at the beach and sell, right? And you're telling me that you cannot make this sport popular? You do not have the tools? I mean, do you know what I mean? And once we make it so that, what it is, and it's funny, we talk about this in the documentary world, the thing that documentaries have to do is that one of the things that will take people to the theater to see a documentary is nothing, but also it has to be something that you feel like you're going to be able to need to talk about. right? Like
You have to feel like going to the theater is part of the
yeah, like it's part of,
activist
it's going to be
movement.
something.
Yeah, you're participating in the.
You're either
movement
you're
by-
participating in the
by just
movement.
going to the.
Yeah, and you don't want to be the one who doesn't know about it, right? So, and that's marketing.
Yeah.
Right? So the women's sport needs to be marketed. I was just with the PSG, and we were just talking about this. PSG in Paris, they have they have half of the Brazilian national team in their men's team, and they're actually doing a great job with the women's team. They're putting so much money into it, and I was told by the general manager that well, I thought that when we put more money in it, it would actually grow. Yeah, I'm surprised it hasn't grown as much. Which again is one of those, well, we tried, right? Because they're doing nothing else, right? They have the most famous male players in the world a couple of miles away practicing every day. They have 50 million Instagram followers. If you took 2 of the women players once a week to visit the training sessions, and they did one selfie and said, loved kicking the ball around with this one, right? Once a week, a different player, right? Just, no, it costs you nothing. And it would start changing the game of, the fans would be allowed to actually say, oh, that's cool, she's cool, right? And there are so many things like that, but you need to appoint someone in charge of, of promoting the game and marketing the game and packaging the game and selling the game. And it's one of those things that unfortunately we'll have to create the hype, and then the hype will take, that barnacle snowball effect, and then it'll be the thing that everybody has to watch. I mean, it's going to be. It's just a matter of, a little time.
We asked a woman, who just started playing soccer, are you following soccer? Yeah, men's soccer, we're following.
Yeah.
Because they think, they can learn more from it.
Yeah. It's also hard to find women's, right? You have to their apps, it's not I watched the entire Copa America on the Facebook page of the Chilean national team.
Yeah.
Live streamed.
Right.
It's really interesting. this
Because it was the
discussion.
only place that I could find to do it.
Social capital is a risk, though, right? When you put your eggs in that basket, you are then creating your own narrative, right? So if we think of sport as part of this social capital, and which one we choose or not choose, those windows open and close depending on what time of year it is or what kind of cultural space we're in. We're talking about the intersection of politics and sport. Right now, it's probably a risky time to promote women's sports. We know this University of Michigan case coming up right now, and USA Gymnastics. We know there's the violation of about 330 female gymnasts and some male gymnasts by the gynecologist that worked for the University of Michigan. Sorry, thank you, Michigan State. Apologies to my colleagues at both institutions. Don't want to give anyone due credit or due problems. But I worry. I do worry about fallbacks to protectionism of women in sport now that these cases have come to light. It's not a worry. It's an unintended consequence of bringing situations to light. And certain sports, for that matter, sports that are concerned maybe more with traditional feminine body images, like gymnastics or figure skating or the like. And so where does that interplay come into effect? So how do we continue to promote all the good things that come with participation of sports, fewer eating disorders, better jobs in school, et cetera, et cetera. High school and college completion rates are higher for women who participate in sports. With this narrative also of the advantages that have been taken in these communities of sports, where a lot of women feel protected, right? That this sport is this place where you can achieve things you maybe weren't able to achieve outside that realm. And so that intersection right now, it's a very interesting time in American sport participation. And so it's kind of like that bubble of Title IX, right? You get to that point and now the pendulum starts swinging again. And with the narrative of those who are political leaders right now of what is the proper role of women in society, especially in American politics, it'll be, that narrative question is really, really important and one that needs some, investigation.
I see Professor Liza Mecker there has a question.
Thank you for this panel. It's fascinating. And what really strikes me is how that we've gone somewhat in our discussions from the global to the U.S. when we talk about gender and women's sports and the progress that's been made
happening is that it's, we're soccer, which has not been entrenched in the U.S., right? And so it's a moment where with Title IX, women were able to enter, even at the lowest level, like at the local level, community level, little girls getting into soccer. And around the world, that culture is just like completely absent, right? So you might have a Brazilian soccer team, but is it the local level? Are there communities, women, girls really getting invested? What are the mechanisms? How to create change? How are you working to create change? How do you see create change can be? Is it through FIFA? Is it through the national organization? Is it through legislation? Obviously, it was the federal legislation that mattered in the U.S. Is it the culture at the ground level? I'm just curious about the strategies and ways you see to make kind of that, the kind of progress that's made in the U.S. kind of global in terms of soccer and other sports.
So I guess it depends what you're trying. There's so many things that need to change, right? So there's the national team level, there's the federation level, and then there's the base, right? Which in Brazil we don't have a base. In most South American, Latin American countries there are no base. And so the fact that the Brazilian national team, the women's team, has 2 silvers is pretty much an act of God and natural talent, because they have absolutely no support. And there was no base. So a lot of those young women played with boys teams. And then they started playing with women's teams and had to actually learn the rules at a time when boys had been playing actual games and competing, and with referees, for years. Well, but so there's so many aspects of this, to fix. Yes, and in Brazil, in many places, it is a grounded level. Europe does a little better at ground level, so they probably need a little more help. I think not every, like you saw at Madrid, like not every franchise has a team. And in Brazil it's the same. They don't. So our franchise is getting much better in Brazil in terms of women, and the level of progress, right, has to also be measured by the level that you started at, right? So football or soccer for women was illegal in Brazil until 1981. So it was illegal for a woman to play soccer until 1981. It was a very popular game in the 40s, and then religious groups, of course, petitioned a sort of a physician who was also in government to deem the game, what was it? It was deemed to be dangerous to the female constitution. So basically it was going to hurt your baby organs. And so there was no more. So until 1981, you weren't allowed to play soccer. It's still not a professional sport, right? Mm-hmm. So you have no benefits, right? You hurt yourself, there's no compensation, when you retire, there are no benefits, you don't enjoy anything that we do here, like Social Security or any stuff like that. So that's another thing. But more than that, I think, more importantly, is it's not just about football. Because football, the state of equality of women's football, right? Not the team, but the actual equality of women's football and like the base that you're talking about, right? The health of the equality of women's football in every country directly reflects the economic health of that country, directly affects it. And it directly reflects it, sorry. It directly reflects the level of gender equality and the issues of gender equality in that country and the economic and political health of that country. So it's just a canary in a coal mine, right? It's just basically showing you, look, this is how messed up we are in all these ways, So it's about the sport as a catalyst for other things, right? And not just girls who want to play in the World Cup. So if you look at that, then I would say that the biggest change that has to come is just to make this a viable option for girls to begin with. And whether they have talent or not, that's, and that has other, there's a million ways. Getting a salary for playing is something that would assuage a lot of fears of parents, right? Because if you could make money, a lot of parents, a lot of the prejudices against it are based on fear, right? Nobody wants their kids to suffer or to be ridiculed or to be, So if you could actually make a viable salary playing it,
right, so
everyone.
In the case of the girl that we're following in the documentary, she's a young Brazilian soccer player. She grew up in a favela, and her father wasn't thrilled about it, obviously. And his attitude changed as soon as she started getting her national team stipend and could bring home sugar and bread for the family. But I was also going to say, so I feel like you're trying to sort of like wrap your head around all the, the global issues. So we've been studying this, and I've also been doing the same thing, like trying to wrap my mind around it. So the way I break it down is I see it as 3 levels of barriers to women, not just soccer, but entering into sports. There's the basic level, barrier to entry, right? Then there's a barrier to continue to play at puberty around that age. Places like Africa, they don't have access to, feminine hygiene products. Most places they don't even have a bathroom. So even if you have feminine hygiene products, you have nowhere to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. And then you have places like, Western countries like the United States, where the barrier is higher. The barrier is more, how do you succeed financially? And then today I added, there's a barrier for, trans athletes, obviously. And, and then I also added the barrier to being a fan, because there is a barrier to being a fan, even specifically in Iran, where women are literally not allowed inside the stadium. So that's how I...
More questions, please. Yes.
Hey, on women's soccer around the world, there's a very accessible book I want to recommend, When Oxygen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Under the Lights and in the Dark.
It's great.
Academic books, but that one, she's an academic, but it's a very readable book. It has also a great chapter about the Portland Thorns fan club.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is really worthwhile reading.
Yeah.
But my question actually, when you talk about coaching boys, one of the things that, in my experience, and I coached boys too for like 15 years, and at the youth leagues, and it was a great experience. One little story was, before then, when I was playing, and my oldest, he was watching me play just women's leagues in the Bay Area, and he was like, "Mom, do boys play soccer?"
Yeah.
And I thought, that's great. But then as he gets older, he learns that, well, there's this whole other world out there, and then he becomes like everybody else and sees that, he's not going to follow women's soccer, he follows men's soccer and American football. But the thing about women and coaching boys, I see a lot more women doing that now, and I think there's a whole generation of women coming up, and a lot of the clubs I know, they're hiring women and hiring them. I mean, it's small pay, it's like a little bit, but that's beginning to happen. But what I also see though is that for a lot of the volunteers, the men seem to have a lot more time or support or something, and can go out and go get all these coaching licenses where, I'm working full-time, single mom, taking care of everything, and a lot of, there's not that opportunity, so like I'm retired now from coaching, but probably because my kids have grown up, but I just felt like, even within that volunteer space for women who are coaching, there are these, the double burden barriers that often prohibit women from advancing, even at that youth sport level.
Right. Or going
And
to
we're
the stadium.
talking dominant 5th grade basketball here, right? So, we went to the district finals. I got to say that in front of everybody. We did well. I think I had to make it, and I think I empathize and, sympathize and live what you just described. I think I made it part of my, I made a cost-benefit analysis, if you will, about, is this how I'm going to spend my time with my kid? And so for me, it was, how am I going to spend 3 hours a week with him and 9 other stinky 10 and 11-year-old boys, but and have him feel as though there is something beneficial about our relationship. So some people do Girl Scout troops, some people do walks in the park and with your dog. I coach, and so for me, that's my social capital with my child. I think that when we talk about symbolically what it meant, I think I said this story to somebody else. On the day of the Women's March, I was coaching a game. And I felt like that was my demonstration of female political leadership, was coaching this basketball game. It just happened to be against the most misogynistic guy in town. So, I mean, that also made me feel really good, too. Why I bring that up, though, I think we're all trying to figure out demonstrations of narratives of leadership and success to everybody we can get in front of. And I think that, for me, that's been the value of coaching the boys. When they come over at the end of the year, it's my stuff that's in the house. My husband didn't have a athletic career that, would have warranted stuff around the house that I, gaze at longingly, remembering. So I think for me, it was how I personally decided I was going to impact my child's life, was through that, kind of like my dad did. It just happens to be that I'm his mom. So.
I think for a long time too, soccer specifically, I was a director of coaching for a club, so I did hiring, and the candidate pool based on sort of artificial licensing as a barrier to entry in soccer was one of those things that we sort of tried to challenge a lot. Primarily because for a very long time, if you played professional soccer at any level of professional soccer for a period of time, you could just get grandfathered into your licensing or your badges in this country. And so whether or not you could actually talk to children and coach children, you could basically jump the queue.
Right.
And it's for so long there wasn't a reciprocal sort of professional opportunity for women, so women didn't get that same. So we got 4-year degrees and went to graduate school and did other things and had families, and then trying to get back into coaching when we're in a place where economically we can make that cost benefit is really difficult. And so there is a concerted effort, I would say, where I am, to sort of bring in those recent college graduates who might be going to graduate school and use it as, train them up, get them trained up, and get them coaching as quickly as possible, irrespective of whether or not they have their badges. And now most clubs do pay for those licensings, but it is definitely a cost benefit piece, and part of that lack of sort of look, coaches are good old boy club too. I mean, I'm sure I know in the Bay Area as well, and certainly in my area in soccer, and we benefited by an influx of expat Brits in the NASL days who stayed, and they were the bastions of soccer knowledge. So we also have this presumption that unless you have an accent, or if you have an accent, that's an extra qualifier for you that we're dealing with. And even if they call you baby, which is not okay. So I do think that it's starting to change, but part of it for a long time was we had all of these licensed individuals that were competent because of this piece of paper and not because of what they did. And it was just really artificial system in the US. I won't get into club pay-for-play model and that whole thing, and I'm not in that world anymore, but that was a piece of it for sure. And I do think that we're starting to change. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I was wondering, with the technological changes to media distribution that's allowed organisations to go over the top of traditional distribution networks, will these tools allow women's sports to take true control of the narrative and make the financial economics work, or will the constrictive nature of traditional media distribution continue?
So I would say we just signed our first streaming. So YouTube's streaming partner of Seattle Sounders FC. We let go of our RSN to make it that case. We still have to figure out how to do every single production element and cost associated with producing the actual content to put on that service. So the service provider may pay us for a package of content. We have to deliver that content. We have a dedicated channel on YouTube. We do not populate 24 hours a day. And so I think there still are financial barriers, some of those other monetization barriers. The platforms themselves have barriers related to, who controls the commercial inventory that are operating differently than in an OTA space or a cable or an RSN space. And in those cable RSN spaces, oftentimes they're looking to do subsequent deals with streaming services, right? They want all your rights. So NBC Sports makes no bones about this. When they come in to do a rights deal, they want everything. They don't want to have to come back to you for anything. So that means that if you are so desperate because maybe they're going to just pay for your production, which is enough in women's sports, you're probably giving up your streaming distribution rights. And as a result, they could sub-license those to Facebook or YouTube or somebody else and make money off of you that you're not going to necessarily see. And so there's a sort of power imbalance in that dynamic still. I think it's fundamentally going to change. Just like the music industry, once we can figure out how to produce things more efficiently and cheaper ourselves, and we take those middlemen out, then the actual putting it up on a website is just a function of bandwidth, right? And going straight to consumers or operating in a women's space, direct sort of consumption, so that she doesn't have to go to Chili's Facebook page, but could just go to the Copa America app, right, for the women. So I do think so. I just think the landscape is changing really, really fast. I would say the better example is in esports right now.
Yeah.
So the Twitch network and the way that Twitch has sort of been able to direct to consumer sort of the platform of esports, and esports is a whole other thing because the IP rights holders of the games control the entire universe, but that actually has sort of disrupted the entire system. And when you talk about 25 million people watching people play video games at one time around the world, that's the power of sort of the new technology for sure.
Thank you for that presentation. A great discussion. I just have a question around my read of the work of Michael Mesler and Sean Cookie as well. So one of the narratives is that if we have better narratives over time, things will change. The takeaway I take from Mesler's work and Cookie's work is that things have actually got worse.
Right.
That the percentages have bounced around about 5% for a long time. And I haven't read the latest book, but at least in the articles, it dropped down to 2%.
Right, yeah.
So the takeaway was it isn't about narrative, it's not about packaging, there's possessive investment in masculinity that the dominant sports culture has and will have and will defend to the end. And so that's quite pessimistic, but I also think it's realistic. I've now got cable TV and I turn on in the mornings and there's channel after channel of men chatting about men's sports, playing poker at Vegas, men fishing in lakes in Florida, hour after hour after hour after hour of men talking shit about other men's sports. And then you've got that 2% that flashes up as poorly produced. So this isn't by accident, there's embedded structures which go way beyond that. And so that's the pessimistic reason. But then there are these other platforms like we've been discussing, like the Burn It Down podcast, which allows different types of distribution to kind of take place. But the fact that ESPN went and got Barstool Sports, however short-lived that was a great indication that the complete, even an institution as sensitive as ESPN to the female audience, still goes after Barstool Sports, one of the most misogynistic spaces for men to chat about sports. So I guess where should we be optimistic? And
No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
and I don't see it happening from the mainstream because of the huge amounts of money. They go to the NBA and to other sports. They need to make back their money. And that money is simply not going to women's sports and will not go to women's sports.
I think it's innovation. I think that because of the way in which we now have access and the possibility to innovate how people access their sports. And you're right, I think the systemic misogyny is just too great to be able to sort of, it's going to be too long for all those middle-aged men to pass away for us to make some change. And, there's an incredible amount of change and progress, and then there's these very specifically placed booby traps that shut everything back down again. So I do think it's innovation. I think it's, and I absolutely think it's going to happen. I also think so women are, there's like a whole other, but women are sort of conditioned to apologize for.
Take the crumbs.
Yeah, right? I mean, I think Abby Wambach, who I love, right, just gave a speech at Barnard, and right, and what did she say? She's like, ask, take the ball, take the ball, demand the ball, demand the Oval Office, demand, so women are, have been sort of trained, to apologize for being smarter, for being, So I think it has to do with demand, because there is demand. I mean, the amount of girls who stream women's soccer is unbelievable. And they stream it from so many different places that it's hard to even have like a data on, how many of them there are. And so it's a matter of sort of unifying, right, and demanding. And I think there are these girls who have grown up playing soccer in the United States, or growing up. I mean, they're getting older. And I believe that's where it is. I think it's going to be an innovation in finding, and using that oppression or that ceiling to, it's like, find genius ways to get around it and overcome it.
I'm horrifically pessimistic since the NFL ruling on protest. The violence that is being perpetuated around patriotism and sport right now makes me feel there's less of a window of opportunity here in inclusion of gender. I understand that it's about protest and wrong and the racial profiling of athletes and the like. I also, in the back of my head, was like, that's the window just closed because of the narrative of patriotism now that is in the what it means to be American and be important. There's a narrative that's very heteromasculine, and that for me made me feel as though that window has now closed.
Although, in Mexico, who doesn't have a league, right? They had 50,000 women, people at a women's game. Chile, you know what I mean? So I think that, for every NFL, there's, lots of progress that we don't see. So.
I just don't think the 50,000 are going to equate the billions of dollars necessarily.
But we doesn't have to.
Well, yeah.
Okay, we have had a fantastic conversation. Unless someone has one very pressing question, we are going to have to shut this down. Any last questions, comments? No? Thanks to our panelists, thanks to the roundtable, fantastic conversation.